con la responsabilidad de llevar a cabo los Juegos es Toronto.
I honestly believe there is something for the mind, something for the body, and something for the soul for virtually every person in Ontario.
And we're only going to build something meaningful and something that really lasts if we combine the energy and talents of the millions of people in this region and the hundreds of millions of people across the Americas.
Pan Am Games, I'm ready.
Pan Am Games coming to Toronto is actually one of the best things that happened to Toronto in a long time.
To have 42 countries all coming together in one spot, it's just so exciting. It's a great way for them to see our beautiful country, to meet such wonderful people.
Really excited.
The segment of the public which matters most, for whom the legacy is most enduring and the experience is most transformational, is young people.
One of the greatest things about the Pan Am Games coming to the greater Toronto area is the opportunity to inspire a new generation.
I think it'll give opportunity for a lot of kids to actually find an athlete that they can look up to.
And get out and enjoy themselves and play some sports and participate.
I think it's important because an athlete tells you and shows you what you can be if you work hard enough at what you do.
The party, the people, the energy, it's just going to be beautiful.
The people from these countries that are going to be attending these games, they know how to party. And they're going to show us how to party, and we're going to show them how to party.
By 2015, we will animate public spaces, parks, beaches, squares, as we have never seen in Toronto before.
The cultural offerings around a major international sports event like the Pan Am Games is only appropriate as a true reflection of not the games themselves, but also what's going on in this amazing city.
Every one of those athletes will find a friend in the city of Toronto.
First time in Toronto, first time in Canada, I'm loving it.
Well, the one thing about the Pan Am Games is that there's a little bit more of a relaxed atmosphere. You're going to see a lot more enjoyment in the eyes of all the athletes competing.
What we really want is to use sport to have a massive celebration of our common humanity.
The right watchwords for our Pan Am Games are about access and engagement. It's about inclusion. And whether it's being great spectators and whether it's about cheering on the athletes, we need to make sure that there's a role for everyone who wants to be involved.
The limits on this are only our own imagination.
The focus of our conversation in this particular segment is the transformational power of sport. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Ian Troop, the CEO of Pan Am Games Toronto 2015, to the stage. Welcome, Ian. As well as Lisa Baird, Chief Marketing Officer for the United States Olympic Committee, coming in from the US. Fantastic. So as is my preference, our introductions will be short. Lisa Baird, 6.5 years at P&G, Folgers, Vicks, some more CPG, some IBM, some consulting, some NFL, which we will bring into this conversation, and now your current role at USOC. Ian, P&G Canada, Mexico, Poland, US, Conagra, OMERS, which is a massive pension fund, and now Pan Am Games. So welcome to you both. Ian, I want to start with you. What does transformation mean in the context of the Pan Am Games? How do you think about it? It's more than just a buzzword.
Well, it's got many layers to it. So you've got to start with the transformation of bricks and mortar. And in fact, that's probably the reason the politicians commit the money in the first place, is to build new infrastructure. And that's very important, but it's only the beginning. You look at the amount of investment we have, you've got an economic legacy, you've got to force that investment into the small, medium, and diverse businesses. You've got a social opportunity and a social legacy that's huge. We're grabbing hold of diversity as being what we think we can make a difference on to kind of take this great region and even improve upon what we think is a tremendously unique region. And you've got the volunteers impact, you've got our need to organize across the region and bringing fragmented groups together in ways that are critical for us, but we think have sustaining benefit thereafter as well.
Lisa, how do you think about that as a notion?
Well, I think at the Olympic committees, which are a little bit different from the event, we really think our center of the universe is the athletes. That's the point of view we always come from. So when you think about that, what the athletes represent as far as Olympic values, friendship, respect, and excellence, it's really their ability to inspire people, nations, and bring the world together through peace, through sport. And Pierre de Coubertin, in 1892, created the Olympic Charter for that very purpose, to bring to the world peace through sport.
Let's keep this history lesson alive, because one of the things we talked about in our call prior to today was something called Title IX, enacted in 1972. I had never heard of this major piece of legislation. It is both both celebrating a milestone this year and also is quite relevant in the world of sport that no one would have necessarily predicted back then. Tell us, this audience, in particular those who are international, what it was and what it has become.
So in 1972, the President of the United States at the time, Richard Nixon, passed a piece of legislation called Title IX, and its primary intention was actually not for sport. It was for access in schools, to create equal access in schools to educational programs for girls. And what happened is that one of the biggest beneficiaries of it were women's sports programs in the United States, at the college level, in particular at the high school level. And there's been a lot written about how enormously profound this single piece of legislation was to up the level of athletics for women in the US, and then correspondingly have its effect worldwide. And it's really been something that's leveled the playing field for women in sports.
One of the things we as viewers are more familiar with, Ian, are para-athletes, athletes that participate in sports we didn't even heard of before. How does that get included within your mandate?
It's essential in our mandate. And I must say, when I got hired as hard last February, and I spent a week watching the Olympics, and very busy days, you're talking to people and meeting them as the Olympics are, came back 2 weeks later and saw the Para Games, and I was blown away. When you watch these athletes and what they do, it's just a whole new level of understanding courage and the ability for us to use games like this, the power of sport to communicate to people, communicate the disability is not a disability. It's the place we think we can look to make a major benchmark and really improve the quality and impact the whole of Pan America in terms of countries getting organized and getting capable to have para programs in their countries as well. So it's essential for us.
So there's varying abilities, gender. There's also the transformation of people across economic classes. Lisa, are there some stories that stand out for you in terms of athletes that have pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, achieved stardom in sports that perhaps they shouldn't economically have ever even been exposed to?
Yeah, and I think, you know, for me, having worked across a number of sports, not only NFL, but some other sports in my career in corporation as a sponsor, I think what the Olympics does that touches all of our hearts around the world is it tells the story of these athletes and the challenges they have to come, the diversity that they have to struggle with. And there's so many that come to mind, but you know, I'll talk about one. Just simple ones. One of our flag bearers in the United States Olympic team flag bearer in Beijing was one of the lost boys of the Sudan. Okay, now think about that. You know, this is a child who was raised in war. At age 6, he was carrying a gun and was actually a soldier in war. And had the opportunity to come to the United States, become an American citizen, and through sport, transform his very life, but also, frankly, be an inspiration. That's a worldwide story. And there's so many. You know, the Paralympians, one of my favorites, and this is one to watch in London, is there's a runner from South Africa who's a double amputee. And he just won or placed second in a 100-meter that's going on, a track and field conference in New York. But you know what? He didn't place one in the Paralympic Games. He placed one on the 100-meter in an against Olympic athletes. So that's the kind of thing that captures the world. And the stories, you know, I'm proud to say that the US owns many of them, but the stories come and they capture the world from every country, every nation, every town, every gender, every culture. And that's the part that I think, you know, that's what captures our imagination, whether it's the Pan Am Games or the Olympic Games.
Certainly leading with that video, most of us in this room probably had at least a little bit of a spine tingle at some point. There's something so compelling about sport as an idea. And yet the statistics are not on the side of sport as it relates to the broader population. We're dealing with obesity across communities, across cultures. How do you reconcile those two things, both this huge opportunity that big sporting events provide and the lack of progress we're having in just keeping our young people fit and going out and kicking a ball around?
Well, you know, I think we're in the hope and inspiration business, really. As I look at the key product we're selling, I mean, to Lisa's point, we're here talking about stories about real people, to engage them, to look at their life differently. And that's how people get engaged in games. It's how they get stories. And so, you know, getting athletes in front of kids at an early age is a key program for us, both to build the awareness of our games, but get those athletes inspiring people. We have things like we're hiring 20,000 volunteers for the games. They will be our face to the world, but there's no reason why you can't have an accreditation process where those volunteers get accredited so they can go in and teach or support volunteer programs after school, because some of our issues on activity are economic and they're structural. So we have an opportunity to be an intervention point to drive a sustaining change in that regard as well. And you know, I think that you've got to look at this from, there's no one solution, but you've got to look at this from a number of different angles. And it's hope, it's structure, it's facilities, it's allowing kids to have a chance to meet somebody to change the way they think about their lives. And it could be as mundane as having people trained so that after school they can run a volunteer program for the kids that don't have any organized sport.
What do you think about when you see the data on obesity, Lisa?
Well, you know, I think it is the responsibility of sport to be a platform for those issues. That's the key thing, is that, you know, nothing engages the world like sports as a platform. And frankly, you know, having come from professional sports and the Olympic world, it can be negative and it can be incredibly positive and transformational. But the point is that the leaders in sport have to have the courage to tackle the tough problems. And obesity is one of them. Health issues are one of them. So how do we work with local governments, Boys and Girls Clubs in the United States, with Michelle Obama on the Let's Move program, to take our athletes, take our outreach programs and make it a platform for us to provide the encouragement to our sponsors and our ecosystem to make sure that they're responding to the issue. We can't solve it alone, but we can be the catalyst that creates the international attention around an issue, and that's our responsibility.
I want to talk about the transformation of communities, and Ian, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I want to start with you, Lisa, because there is a story around Katrina that you talked a little bit about. Paint the picture of what was going on there in the reopening of the Superdome.
I joined the National Football League. For those of you outside of the United States, it's the NFL. It's clearly one of the most popular sports in the U.S. And I joined the league a month before Katrina hit New Orleans. And I joined and began to work for a man that I'd probably say is one of the greatest people I've ever worked for, had the privilege to work for in my life. His name is Commissioner Paul Tagliabue. And he, believe it or not, you know, new person, brought me on a plane, and we, over the course of 6 months, made probably 8 trips down to New Orleans to see the devastation that had occurred, to talk to parish people, to begin that process of saying, you know what, we need to rebuild and we need to find a way for the team and ownership of the New Orleans Saints to stay in New Orleans. And it was a process of bringing hope and making decisive acts at a time when no one had hope for the city of New Orleans. And Paul Tagliabue came out and said, we're going to keep this team here. There were no training centers, there was no money to keep the team there. He got the other NFL owners to give money out of their pocket to keep the team there. Why? Was football what New Orleans needed at that time? They needed shelter, they needed transportation, they needed jobs. No, but what football could do was to be a catalyst for the community to believe that they could rebuild it. And about I guess in December, we were standing in the Superdome and we were talking to Louisiana leadership, and we were convincing them to take the risk to say that they could reopen the Superdome and really get it ready in time to host the Saints game. And the commissioner and I were talking on the plane on the way back. I think it was like 1 or 2 in the morning, and I said, Paul, let's not just throw a party here. Let's make sure that the Saints' first home game is in the Superdome and it's rebuilt. Let's take the risk. That was an enormous risk to take because, as those of you know, putting together the NFL schedule with all the constituents and getting everybody to take a risk and do that, you have to do it months in advance. But he said, you know, tell me about that, why? And I said, because what the world needs is they need that positive image of the Superdome to replace the haunting image of the crime and the shelter and the refugee staff. That's what a sports platform can do. That's a transformation that Ian and I believe in that can help tackle the problems you've talked about. And for me, it was one of the, you know, the greatest privileges of all to be able to do something that, you know, helped that issue.
Ian, you're still a couple years down the road. As you plan, brainstorm, engage community leaders, he's sweating. He's like, a couple years, it's happening tomorrow. Oh my God.
212 weeks, but who's counting?
212 weeks. What are some of the initiatives that are on your plate in terms of community transformation, perhaps their infrastructure, perhaps their, you know, in terms of, I don't know, other things that you're looking at that you're excited about for Pan Am Games?
Well, you know, certainly the community, you've got to reach in, and this has got to represent our community, which is one of the most diverse in the world. 46% of Torontonians with GTA are born outside of Canada, and you've got to recognize that in terms of what kind of organization we have, and then how we reach in to make sure people feel part of that. So, you know, there's a lot of work to go after youth, and there's a lot of work that's starting with schools and getting athletes in front of kids. I'm a big believer in the power of role models, having watched role models do things with my kids that I couldn't possibly have done no matter how much I talked to them. And we need to get those athletes who tend to be terrific role models in front of kids. And we're finished pilot testing, rolling out a school program across the province as one aspect. Another aspect is going into the ethnic communities in Toronto. And the first step we have to do is we have to kind of map our way in, because there may be a Guatemalan population in the southern Ontario of 20,000 people, but there are 4 different waves of immigration, and you've got to go find those leaders. But what we'd like to see happen, is those communities align. This becomes an aligning device, which they come and they welcome their teams in. They become volunteers because they want to be part of it. They become great spectators, and they're both Canadians, and they're also El Salvadorians or the Guatemalans, and being able to activate them in a meaningful way to be part of this and take ownership is a huge opportunity, and what will make this be kind of a World Cup meets the Olympics. When I was in Vancouver, you know, they had this, if anybody was there, it's almost, you can't forget it, the Robson Granville, the 2 streets downtown Vancouver were closed. And after every game, there was just throngs of people. And after the hockey game, the final game, the noise was deafening.
Was that when Canada beat the U.S.?
Yes.
Was that game?
It was just a little bit after.
You had to bring that up.
Was that game?
That was a little bit after when the women beat the women's U.S. team, too.
Yeah. But the Paralympic hockey team beat Canada in the final.
No, the Japanese got us, I think. But you're walking down these streets and you see this incredible diversity. You have people in walkers, and you've got kids in papooses, and you've got all sorts of diversity. And I remember just saying, I was struck by the diversity and the sweetness of that atmosphere and a true sense of global village. And the next day I was having breakfast with Scott Moore, who was at the CBC then. He's now working at Rogers. And Scott says, you know, I think that a lot of people in Vancouver have now lost their hyphen. They're no longer Indo-Canadian. They're no longer Chinese-Canadian. They're Canadian. And it's the power of sport to bring people together like almost nothing else. Maybe music is close. And we've got to leverage that.
Do you find that's a difference from the NFL world, where people were team aligned, to USOC, when all of America can root for an athlete in a particular sport because we're all aligned as a country in a way that only happens every couple of years?
Yeah, you know, I do think, you know, in America, it's a bit unique, perhaps in Canada too, but our Olympic team brings us together as a country. I think in countries in Europe and in South America, you have the national pride that comes with your soccer team and the national pride that comes to your Olympic team. But we're unique in that it is the ability to bring the country together. And I think in the NFL, the major difference is it's truly about winning. And anybody who's associated with the NFL knows, whether it's player, coach, assistant, broadcaster, each one of those 17 games is critical because it's all about who gets to the playoffs and wins the Super Bowl. In the Olympics, it is a little different. Well, you will talk to athletes and say that it is about the gold medal and or the silver and the bronze. For most of them, it's about the journey that gets them there. And frankly, whether they're finishing just they're crossing the finish line or winning the gold, it's a transformational experience for them. So I do think that is probably the biggest difference between pro sports like FIFA and the NFL and the Olympics.
Transformation includes infrastructure. It might not be as emotional as some of the things we've talked about, but certainly in Vancouver, there was no rail link from the airport to downtown prior to the Olympic Games. So as you look to Toronto, how do you think about the infrastructure piece and how do you manage all the constituents in ensuring that that legacy, God, I'm dying to know what you're going to say. Your wheels are turning so fast, the smoke's coming out of your head here.
Those are two very different questions, Bruce.
Okay.
Yeah, certainly the infrastructure is a critical part of why we've done the games. And Ontario, as a province, had not invested in infrastructure for many, many years, decades. And it was showing in our rate of participation and our rate of high-performance sport. So KP&G's looked at this and said this is the biggest investment in legacy infrastructure they've ever seen. And that's why and we're an event. We happen. July 10th, 2015, whether we're ready or not, we're going to